I was a P-47 fighter pilot. P-47 was a aircraft used in my mission that I flew, was primarily in support of the ground forces, interdiction of supply lines and that sort of thing.
What kind of a plane was it? A small plane?
It's a single engine, rather large fighter for its time, with a massive engine and 8 machine guns firing forward. It was a pretty large fighter, well armed and designed for that kind of work, really.
And what did you do with this aircraft? What kinds of things did you do with it?
The kind of mission, typical kind of mission that you'd fly would be one to destroy, well, trains was a big target. Anything moving in the way of German supply lines was prime targets. As a matter of fact, they were priority targets. And sometimes, although not too often, we worked in direct support of the troops. That is, putting firepower on their opposing lines. But usually it was, as I just said, the kind of thing that would ultimately destroy the enemy's ability to supply their front line. So,
what was the crew like? Who did what in one of these airplanes?
Okay, it was a single engine, a single place aircraft. In other words, pilot only, and you did everything. Not only operate the aircraft and navigate, but you fired the guns, you dropped the bombs, you fired the rockets, and if you got into a dogfight, you had been trained to engage and do your best to shoot down the opposing force. So it was really it was a multifaceted mission that we performed.
A stupid question, was this a difficult thing to do, or was it something that you got, was it like eventually like riding a bicycle? I mean, you just did it by instinct?
Well, no, it wasn't. It never was quite that easy, I guess. First of all, it took quite a lot of training to be able to handle all the different tasks I've mentioned. The biggest task, of course, of all was learning how to fly the airplane, because it was a challenging airplane to fly. And once you mastered it, then it was a delightful airplane to fly. Of course, your training usually included gunnery training, and of course navigation training, getting from point A to point B and back, air-to-air combat training. The fighter pilot in World War II was trained in many facets of the role of a fighter pilot. Today, not necessarily so.
What was the, if you could say, the casualty rate for this kind of job? I mean, were the planes that you flew pretty safe, or could they get into a lot of trouble?
Well, as far as the basic aircraft reliability, it was a good airplane to fly because it would bring you back. If you had battle damage, it had to be extremely severe battle damage to prevent the airplane from flying. It was tough. They called it the Jug, the J-U-G, Jug, because in many respects it sort of looked like a jug because of its bulbous nose with the big engine up front and all that. Now, it had losses. I don't mean to infer that it didn't, but the losses were directly proportional to the kind of opposition you encountered. In the mission that I was primarily engaged in, the major threat was from ground fire, and the Germans were masters at it. They'd had lots of practice for years now at developing their ability to shoot down airplanes, and they were good at it. And of course, it was our job often to penetrate into these kind of defenses and hopefully return. A lot of people didn't.
So was your challenge to stay above the ground fire yet still get close enough to your target to be effective?
Well, it was very hard to get above the ground fire because they had large anti-aircraft guns that would fire, at 30,000 feet you could still be a target. So it's very hard to get above it. If anything, we tended to stay low to stay out of the range of some weapons. The lower the aircraft is flying, the less the response time and the less the visual envelope that the anti-aircraft gunner has. And so we flew very few missions right on the deck, as you say, right on at very extremely low altitudes. But usually we went into the target area at anywhere from 4,000 to 8,000 feet. And but we do it the route would be planned in such a way to minimize the exposure until we got to the target area.
When did you enter the war?
I entered the war late. I was a late comer because I was one of those unfortunate individuals who was tapped as an instructor back in the CONUS and in the United States, and as a result, it took me a year to get freed from that job before I got into the war. I got into the war just at the close of the end of the Bastogne, as we were cleaning out Bastogne.
So would the Battle of Bastogne would you call that maybe the beginning of the end of the war as far as, what was the beginning of the end?
Well, I think the beginning of the end of the war, if you really wanted to go back to it, was the breakthrough at Saint-Lô in France, where we finally broke through the German perimeter and got inside of their defenses. But certainly the Bulge was probably the last, I guess analysts would now say it was the last real attempt on the part of the Germans to really continue the battle. And that was their last opportunity. And when we finally broke through and cleaned out the Bulge, from then on the war changed entirely.
Was there a stated goal for the Battle of the Bulge? I mean, was everybody working towards a common, obviously everybody for a common purpose, but did the Battle of the Bulge, going into it, did people understand that it could be the beginning of the end, or that it was as crucial a battle as it turned out?
No, I think on the contrary, I think the Bulge developed as somewhat of a surprise to the American forces. They did not anticipate it to occur, and I think history shows that that surprise cost us a lot because it was in the dead of the winter in December, and it was a bad winter, and we were ill prepared, just from our equipment, the soldiers on the ground, their equipment, their boots and so on. After the war was over, the hospital beds were lined with men with nothing else wrong with them but just frostbite, and some of them lost their limbs and so on, feet, because of that. It was a once Bulge started, it was a crisis that we had to overcome.
What, from your perspective up in the air, what was the geography of the Battle of the Bulge? I mean, from where did it go? How did it progress?
Well, it actually was fairly closely contained. It's in a semi-mountainous region of the German, Belgian perimeter area, a border area. when I say mountainous, there's no peaks, but I guess you'd call it more like a Piedmont of Virginia. And it was difficult for, it wasn't a wide open place for armor to move quickly on the ground. And it was a lot of digging in and fighting. And of course the Germans employed their tanks so well that it was very difficult to root them out. And had the weather been favorable, it would not have lasted so long, but the weather turned real bad, and we were unable to get air power in. And it wasn't until the weather broke and air power was able to come in and help that we finally broke it loose and routed them.
If this battle was such a surprise, and if the Allied troops were not well prepared for it, how did they get from that point to winning the battle? What made the win there?
Well, after that, after the Battle of the Bulge, Bastogne area.
Wait, Bastogne was part of the battle.
That's right. It really centered around the area of Bastogne. After that, the Germans took a terrific, were defeated badly there. Patton with his Third Army came in and all, and it finally became a rout of German forces. And after that, there was really very little significant organized, planned, strategic resistance on the part of the Germans. It was merely a fall back and survive policy that they knew the war was over, I think, then. And they knew that it was just a matter of time before they had to capitulate.
So it sounds like they put all the firepower they could into this battle as a sort of a last
Yeah,
stand.
That's pretty much the way it was, yes. Yes, I think they realized that this was a last chance.
Were you also supporting the Allies crossed the Rhine, which was also a key marker toward the end of the war? And did you fly support for that?
Yes,
Tell me about it.
this was the portion I was involved in was the area up around Wesel, Wessel, Germany, and it was probably one of the most ferocious battles that I got involved in because of the ground fire. They did this with airborne troops, and they used gliders to bring the troops in get across the river.
They did, or we did?
We did. The Army did. And it was a massive effort on our part, and we went right into a hellfire ground fire because the Germans had figured it out, and they had put in gun emplacements of all calibers, and it was tough. And we were, the mission of my squadron and my group, my squadron was the 513th Fighter Bomber Squadron of the 406 Fighter Group. And our mission was suppress ground fire. And we lost 6 pilots that day, shot down. Recovered some later, but it was tough. It was I think one of the most, as I think about the war, the thing that comes back to me so often is watching these paratroopers go parachuting in, watching these gliders go in with troops on board and crashing one on top of the other, whatever, to get into the DZ, the drop zone, and it was a nightmare. P-40 Goonie birds towed the gliders in, and Goonie birds were getting shot down with the glider still tied onto them, and then the glider pilot trying to figure out how to get disconnected from it and glide in. It was quite a scene.
Why was it such a mess?
I guess I guess it really wasn't a mess more than you'd expect, because anytime you're going to have a mass intrusion like that, it's got to be complicated. And it's very difficult to be totally orderly in the old 1, 2, 3, 4 fashion. It just gets to be a lot of confusion. And that's where individualism and their abilities to make things work comes in. It just always happens. You can look at the D-Day landings, and it's the same thing. You know, wherever you have such an operation of a lot of men, a lot of equipment going in against the enemy in a short time in a confined area, it gets to be complicated.
What was the tightest spot you found yourself in all of this?
Well, the tightest spot I found myself in was the day I shot down a 109. The Me-109 is a very good fighter airplane, and I was chasing one, and he had we'd broken off the part of the battle where you try to gain position, and I had gained position, and he knew it, and so he started running just straight out, and I was chasing him. The 109 is faster than the P-47, and but I was able at long range to get a few strikes on him, and I guess he thought it was his time, and so he pulled the airplane up into a loop and then started right back down to the ground. We call this a split S in pilot terminology. And P-47 is a heavy airplane and not designed to split S at low altitude, and I followed him down through. After a point, you get committed and you just don't break off. You just press on, I find. And he completed his loop, his split S, and I completed mine. But as I completed mine, I clipped the top out of a pine tree. And suddenly in the cockpit, there was pine needles that smelled real good. I thought it was the end. But the old jug clipped the tree and came on up fighting, and I finally got him. that was the part. That was probably the most. That was one time when I thought I really bought the farm.
How were you injured or wounded?
I was wounded in the Korean War. Yeah, I was later in the Korean War. I was doing the same kind of thing, the same kind of mission, only against tanks up in North Korea. And a tank and I exchanged rounds, and he had a better shot than I did.
So how did the war end for what? After the crossing of the Rhine, what was the rest of your experience?
From then on, it became, well, the war was over shortly after. We crossed the Rhine, I believe it was the 16th of April. And from then on, we just, we had targets of opportunities. You go out on a mission with just a flight and just look for targets. If we had assigned targets and intelligence could provide us targets, of course we went directly to them. But otherwise, it was just, we just go out and look for targets. And you'd always find something, you know. And anything that moved on the ground was considered fair game. And that's what we went for, to try to totally cut off all supply and that he possibly. They supplied themselves in various ways. It was nothing to see. They had huge motorcycles, and behind these huge motorcycles they'd tow trailers. And you'd see a motorcycle going down the road with a trailer behind it, and that was fair game. Although it was one man, you went after him. So that was how the war wound down. The last mission I flew was on the 3rd of April. I'm sorry, 3rd of May. And it was a mission to sink a boat up in the North Sea, up in the Jutland area of Germany. As the war was apparently to the Germans, you know, over, they of course tried all sorts of things, and In this particular case, they were trying to escape to Norway with troops. And we were sent up to sink a vessel up there loaded with troops on the way to Norway, which we succeeded in. But even the last mission like that, and I don't think we encountered very little ground fire, probably small alarms from the troops, that's about all. But nevertheless, we lost a pilot. A pilot was killed on that flight. So even the last mission of the war, we still had losses.
How did you feel when it was over with? Did you breathe a sigh of relief, or did you feel that letdown that comes from having accomplished something but not having to do it anymore?
Well, personally, it became very boring after that. You know, all the adrenaline was just fizzled down to nothing, and there wasn't any flowing anymore, and it became very boring. And for many of my squadron mates, however, who were really wanted to get back home, it was a great day for them. You know, a lot of celebration in that regard. But for me and others, like a number of them like me, what do we do now? You know? So what we did then, we started flying exhibition flights for the Russians, for the British, for anywhere that they wanted a flyby of airplanes to celebrate the victory. Well, we were involved. The Eiffel Tower flybys and all that sort of stuff. We spent a lot of time doing that.
You know, I think, as you know, one of the questions that always comes up about those who fly planes in wars is how involved are they really in this war? Are they, because they're up there in the sky sort of looking down on it and not having real personal contact with the people that they affect in one way or another, are they detached from it? What was that experience like for you?
Well, yeah, having first been in the World War II, then later flying a year in Korean War and later in Vietnam, there is a certain detachment, definitely. But it isn't that you don't have interest in their problems. It's just that you've got enough problems of your own in carrying out your mission and doing it successfully. So it's two missions, and they're not in isolation, but they're not totally in harmony because they have two different missions. And that certainly is true of, you know, you get a lot of the ground pounders, we call them. Anybody who was on the ground fighting the war was a ground pounder. We get a lot of flack from them that you fighter boys don't even know what the war is about. And that's true. We didn't know what their war was about nearly as well as they did. That's certainly true, because we didn't have the experiences. But we had our own to contend with. And a pilot shot down was a major catastrophe for a squadron when you only have, say, 30 pilots, 30 people that you're close to, and one of them or two of them is lost. And on the day the Weissel landing, our group lost 6 pilots that day. It was a major, it's a major event for us. So there's two kinds of war. There's an air war and the ground war. There's no difference. They're certainly not the same.
What now that you've been separated from this for about 50 years, what role did this experience in World War II have in your larger life? I mean, do you see it as one of the most important times in your life, or just another one I mean, how do you look back on World War II?
World War II was a time of sort of universal commitment, and it seems like everyone was involved in some way or other, and it was a time of closeness, not only in military organizations, but in the community too, and that I've never experienced since, either in the Korean War or Vietnam War or either one. It was a different time. The commonality of purpose, I think, was what was unique about that.
And in terms of its effect on on Russell Crutchlow's life, what kind of an effect? I mean, it's a real vague question, but how did it, I guess you could ask, how did it change you, or what did you learn from that experience that you took on for the rest of your life?
I guess what I learned that stayed with me.
Hold on a second to the plane. Okay, whenever you're ready.
Okay, what you learned?
What I learned from World War II is, which I later reflected back on in other wars, is that when the common purpose is the same for everyone, there is never a thought about anything but success. And that you can apply to your life as well. As long as you have made up your mind that you're going to succeed at something, well, you can.
That's good enough. Did we miss anything real important? I mean, certainly that's not everything. But
no. I don't know if we did or not. I could tell you stories, of course, but that's not what you're really interested in. I think we probably covered most of the things that I've experienced. We didn't talk about one aspect of what I experienced, and that is support of the bomber force. The support of the high-flying bomber force was a different kind of mission. The fighter mission there was protect, and that becomes an entirely different scene. You can imagine, yesterday you were down at ground level supporting the troops, shooting up trucks and tanks and that sort of thing, and today now you're up at 30,000 feet supporting the B-17s, an entirely different world. A world where high-altitude flak shoots down planes quickly, where the German fighters, all that they have left, are up there trying to prevent the bombers from getting to their targets. And the air battle that ensues is something to behold, and it's something that you never forget. To look out one side and see a B-17 with a wing shot off, spinning down, and you look up behind you and there's a 109 trying to get on your tail, and look up ahead, there's one making a head-on pass at a B. It was a terrible scene. Now, they've tried to depict this a lot in the movies. It's very hard to do because of the panorama that's involved as you sit there, as you're up there doing what you're supposed to be doing. And of course, what you're trying to do is to get to the fighters or somehow disrupt their attack so that they can't successfully get to the bombers. And the scenes are just unbelievable, unbelievable scenes.
It sounds like that was more affecting to you than the groundwork.
Yeah, because of the magnitude of loss that occurs when a large airplane a wing is shot off or it catches on fire, and you just know what those people on board are going through. Some are going to get out, some aren't. And oftentimes, particularly if a wing is shot off, it goes into a spin, you just don't get out of the airplane. There's so much inertia going against your efforts trying to just open a hatch and get out that you can't overcome it. The bomber guys took a real beating at times. And did you happen to know that the greatest losses American forces ever had in any one day were sustained by the Army Air Corps in one day? And it was on the Schweinfurt raids against the ball-bearing plants in Schweinfurt, Germany by the B-17s, daylight raids. But that's a different scene. I wasn't thrown in that too often, but whenever I was, it was something that you didn't forget.
Okay. And we're about out of tape, right?
Yeah.
Let's stop. I got...
In the fall of 1944, the beginning of the end of the European theater of World War II came into view. There was no doubt about this war. German forces were intent on taking over Europe and turning it into what many expected might be a concentration camp. They were good fighters, well equipped, but they were met on the battlefield by soldiers from America, many of whom went on to live their lives in Hampton Roads. This is the story of those last months of the war told through the experience of 5 of those veterans. It begins in North Africa, the staging area for the final push of the Allied forces through Sicily and Italy north into Germany. It was there that General George Patton, emblematic of the best of the American resolve to save Europe, came riding into the lives of those who went on to win the war. One of those was Tom Huggins, now of Hampton, then a platoon leader with the 894th Tank Destroyer Battalion.
Jumped out of his tank wearing his shiny helmet, his pearl-handled pistols, his riding boots and breeches with his riding crop just whapping against his leg. Where is the blankety man? He could curse. Commanding officer of this scruffy, no-good outfit. And we were scruffy, we were, there's no doubt about it. We were filthy, undisciplined, every man was more or less on his own, and the British were laughing at us. They were really poking fun at us. I mean, they were disciplined, whereas we were just, you know, we were not disciplined. And so here comes the captain. General Patton says, "Captain," he says, "I know why you look like a bum, but I know why your men look like a bum, because look at you." And he says, "Why don't you have a haircut, and why aren't you shaved?" He said, "Well, sir, shaved, we're here at the edge of the desert, we're short on water. Fetch your Jeep." He had the driver bring the Jeep, raise the hood, open the radiator, stick your finger in there. Do you feel anything wet? In those days you didn't have foamy, you used a brush and soap. And he says, "Now, I want every man shaved within the next hour."
We had wool uniforms. We didn't have all the fancy things that they have today for desert training and camouflage and boots and nets, helmets and this sort of thing. We had the old GI helmet with a helmet liner. We had wool uniforms. We had leggings, and we had to wear a tie. And we could take the tie off from 2 to 4 o'clock, 2 in the afternoon to 4. We were allowed to take the tie off in Africa, which was in the combat area. And so the discipline was tough, and it paid off. And I think that's what I'll always remember Patton for those. Thank him for instilling that into all the personnel, that you're the best, you're tough, you can do it, you can win, and do it. And the history of the division proved that Hell on Wheels was a good name.
That time, Dan McNeil, now of Hampton, was the extra man in a tank crew. He was cannon fodder, he was told, placed in the crew to become a casualty of war or to replace a crew member that might be lost. Dan McNeil's tank battalion gave itself the name Hell on Wheels and set off from Tunis up the Mediterranean, first to Sicily, where it landed on D-Day in June of 1944. A traveling tank was a hard place to work.
It's very hot. The fumes from the guns are very bad, and sometimes you can't see at all in there. It's very tight, very close quarters, and sometimes you stay in there for long periods of time. In the Battle of the Bulge, it was 2 weeks in the Ardennes in wintertime, where we did not, I did not wash my hands for 2 weeks straight. And we were warned that there would be very tense days, there would be losses, there would be casualties. And of course, we psychologically, we trained for this. And we were pretty young, we were healthy.
Willie Hilton grew up in Newport News. He and thousands of black Americans served in the war, but after they enlisted, they seemed to disappear into the record of that time. In now Reverend Hilton's case, as an Army engineer, he preceded the white soldiers in battle, clearing the battlefield of landmines and building bridges before they arrived. He experienced two different kinds of war.
It's really a sad situation. There was the black soldiers did a lot of good things, and they did fight. I mean, fought, and it was left completely out. And really, we was fighting two wars. You know, two wars. There was the racist, and then, you know, it was still existing even on the battlefield.
When Willie Hilton set out on his journey to war, which would eventually bring him to this church, he says that the window shades were pulled down part of the way on the train from Richmond to his embarkation point because Negroes were not supposed to be seen on these trains in some parts of the country. But they did the job that was set before them.
Our job was to fight and work. See, being in the combat, on the front line, you had to protect yourself and also get the job done.
Cleto Leone grew up in Detroit. He once thought he would like to be a doctor, so he became a medic. But to get to his job in the war, he had to take a ride by parachute behind enemy lines.
And it was kind of fun in a way. It's like you're taking a ride down a roller coaster. When you're going down, it's just great. You get off the roller coaster and you want to do it again. It was a good jump. In fact, I had a soft landing, a big manure pile. I stunk for a few hours.
Cleto Leone had to patch up the wounded as best he could and send them back to battle in most cases. It was harrowing work only the first time he had to do it.
I sutured his face, and we sent him back to the lines. He walked back to the lines, back lines. That was my first casualty that night. And from then on, it was easy to do the job. But you're always scared, you're going to get hit too, because when the guy gets hit, he's right on the line. He's right in the foxhole. They'll yell medic. And you go to that foxhole, and you're just as exposed as anybody else.
Russell Crutchlow, now of Seaford, began a career that would take him on to Korea and Vietnam as the pilot of an ungainly-looking fighter plane that served him well.
I was a P-47 fighter pilot. Single-place aircraft, in other words, pilot only. And you did everything, not only operate the aircraft and navigate, but you fired the guns, you dropped the bombs, you fired the rockets, and if you got into a dogfight, you had been trained to engage and do your best to shoot down the opposing force. It was a good airplane to fly because it would bring you back. If you had battle damage, it had to be extremely severe battle damage to prevent the airplane from flying. It was tough. They called it the jug.
The jug was one of the tools of war, like tanks and guns and hands and parachutes. In the fall of 1944, these tools and the men who used them converged on the final battleground in Europe.
Tanks open up on Firenzuola. Allied firepower pulverizes the objective.
We were supposed to move out at daybreak. I said to myself, I better take another look. So I made a reconnaissance to be sure, double check, and made a little sketch to go back and confirm with my tank commanders what they were supposed to do and how to go. And I looked in this field and there was haystacks there. So this right away told me that the enemy was there. And sure enough, they were.
Tom Huggins was chosen to scout ahead of his battalion for the Allied landing at Anzio in Italy at the start of 1944. His job was to prepare the landing site for the dewaterproofing of tanks that would come ashore. It was after that he encountered the exploding haystacks in the field and was shot.
When we started moving, they started firing. Started firing back at them. I mean, haystacks blowing up everywhere, but shells falling everywhere, and that was when I was wounded. It was a shell hit near me, and one I wasn't killed, but luckily I wasn't. And I was hit a piece in the chest, legs, and this right hand right here, this knuckle was broken. The biggest thing that surprised me was this metal hitting me was red hot and it burned. I mean, I felt like I was somebody sticking cigarettes to you, you know. That's about the only way I can explain it. So I yelled medic, and that quick, here they were. They had me on a stretcher.
After recuperating in Naples, he returned to the fighting that reclaimed all of Italy and liberated Rome.
At marching through Rome, the people cheered us through flowers, and I was hit by a loaf of bread. And I held on to that bread, and I'm telling you, I'll never forget how good it was, because we were eating out of cans all the time, and this was fresh. So it went on forward. And
the advance had been so fast from D-Day up into December that that particular area in the Ardennes, from Luxembourg on in there to through the Ardennes area, it was wintertime, it was snow on the ground, the weather was bad. So that when the German hit with all of that might, all of those panzer divisions, tank divisions, infantry, when they hit, of course, they punched a hole 50 to 60 miles deep. That was the result of that. We took a lot of casualties in the Battle of the Bulge, and the Germans took even more.
The Battle of the Bulge was the beginning of the end of the war for Germany. It took place in the bitter cold and snow of the winter of 1945. Willie Hilton and his fellow engineers had been literally crawling across the battlegrounds leading up to that point.
We had to get on our knees, side shoulder by shoulder, with a bayonet, probing from left to right, and moving in breath up at night. And when we hit, that bayonet hit up any metal, you leave your bayonet sticking up, so you know what, and then everybody withdraw back but you. And that's your job then, to deactivate that mine. And many times that we have done that and saved lots of soldiers' lives.
When the Germans pushed forward and made that bulge, we were sent there to hold Bastogne, which is a crossroads. And hold it we did. And the Germans just bypassed us and continued on. But we denied them those crossroads. It wasn't a picnic. It was hard. You're told, okay, we're going to move out tomorrow and we're going to take those woods. We move out and take the woods. A lot of us didn't make it, and a lot of people are still buried there. A lot of them were wounded in their back, but it's something that you had to do.
Patton's armor races madly to the relief of Bastogne, where parts of the 9th and 10th Armored Divisions and the 101st Airborne, tough paratroopers and glider men were surrounded by the enemy.
Patton finally broke through, and we were no longer surrounded. We got supplies, because we didn't have much to eat. We didn't have much in fact, we were shooting German machine guns. And we did hold the Bastogne and denied the Germans the crossroads that they needed in order to make that Battle of the Bulge a success.
Russell Crutchlow participated in the Battle of the Bulge from the sky.
It's two missions, and they're not in isolation, but they're not totally in harmony because they have two different missions. And that certainly is true of, you know, you get a lot of the ground pounders, we call them. Anybody that was on the ground fighting the war was a ground pounder. We get a lot of flack from them that you fighter boys don't even know what the war is about. And that's true. We didn't know what their war was about nearly as well as they did. That's certainly true, because we didn't have the experiences. But we had our own to contend with. And a pilot shot down was a major catastrophe for a squadron when you only have, say, 30 pilots, 30 people that you're close to, and one of them or two of them is lost. And on the day the Weissel landing, our group lost 6 pilots that day.
Certainly it was the end of the war, in my opinion, for the Germans. And it delayed the war. Instead of pushing forward where we were in December into the January and February, we were delayed a good month and a half before we could get the Bulge out of the way and then get reinforced and then crank up the offensive and march on toward the Rhine and then eventually into the heartland.
After the Battle of the Bulge, the next step to victory was the crossing of the Rhine River by Allied troops. It was a gathering of forces for a final assault on the heart of Germany.
We constructed bridges, all type of bridges, to transport the soldiers across the Rhine River, the Oil River.
We would be into what they call a holding area. The engineers would be up there, sometimes under fire, putting those pontoons across, and then when the pontoon bridge was ready, they would call us up by unit, and we would go sometimes bumper to bumper across those bridges. And that's the way we crossed. We crossed the Ruhr that way, we crossed the Rhine that way. And very dangerous at times because sometimes the Germans would be strafing.
I thought at one point after we built the first bridge across the Rhine River, I thought that the men would be a little shaky because the whole river was covered with bodies because the bridge, you know, they were large against the bridge, and the whole river was just covered with dead men.
As I think about the war, the thing that comes back to me so often is watching these paratroopers go parachuting in, watching these gliders go in with troops on board and crashing one on top of the other, whatever, you know, to get into the DZ, the drop zone, and it was a nightmare. P-40 Goonie birds towed the gliders in, and Goonie birds were getting shot down with the glider still tied onto them, and then the glider pilot trying to figure out how to get disconnected from it and glide in. It was quite a scene.
One night, in an eerie respite from the fighting, Willie Hilton sat alone in a foxhole.
And the dangerous time of war is when everything's quiet. I mean, you don't hear a sound, nothing. That's the dangerous part of it, because it means that either they're infiltrating your main line of resistance or something going on, but you can't put it together. So everything's on alert. And they start shelling. And that night, the Lord called me to preach. He called me to preach in the foxhole. And I heard it just as plain as right now. And I'm talking to you, preach my gospel. And I thought I was having a hallucination. And I said, I'm not going to tell nobody. I think I done had too much. But it never left. It never left. It stayed with me.
Entering the final phase of victory over Hitler's Nazis, Yank armies swarm across Western Germany, bringing devastation to cities of the Reich.
I was still with the French, and the war finally ended for us near Lake Maggiore. We called it Lake Maggiore, which was just south of the Swiss border. And oh, what a happy day, what a happy day. I mean, thousands and thousands of German prisoners we took. And we escorted back to a holding area. Okay. A point in my memory at this time was going home. I mean, that was on everybody's mind.
And we all knew then the sooner to get it over with, the sooner we'd go home. And that's exactly what happened. We were always stretching out, moving along, and every day that we made 50 miles, we knew we were that much closer to the end. And finally, when we had them on the run through the Ruhr area, where we captured about 300,000 prisoners, we knew then that the Elbe was next, and after the Elbe, we were making about 50 miles a day then, right up the Autobahns, the superhighways, and we got Magdeburg on the Elbe when we were stopped. And that was a political move because that had already been decided at Yalta, and we didn't know anything about that. Soldiers weren't told very much in those days, and there were no TV or any communication. So we were stopped at the Elbe River, 60 miles from Berlin. We could have been there in another day or two.
The Russians demanded and received the option of going first into captured Berlin. They had a score to settle, and it's generally agreed that they left Berlin in even worse shape than they found it. American forces cooled their heels outside Berlin until the 4th of July, and then most of them came home.
That ship coming into New York with all the fireboats out there and the Statue of Liberty was something that you just can't describe it. You just can't describe it. And then to get off and go and get a milkshake or something like that so easy, when it was so difficult to get anything like that, even maybe a little ice cream or something in Sicily, it was a big deal. But to come home and get a milkshake and a hot dog or a hamburger or something, it's just an incredible feeling.
Oh, what a happy day. I was put aboard a converted French luxury liner and slept in the swimming pool. It was drained, of course, and had a canvas over it. That was about the end of it. And came home, and everybody was glad to see everybody, I tell you.
It was really bitter after all that, and come home and we couldn't get a job. You know, the job was hard to find. The job where, you know, we were trained to fight. That's not our occupation. You know, you can take that as a occupation, but we learned so much more. I learned how to handle every heavyweight equipment. I learned that. I know the link cranes and bulldozers and all of the road graders, all that stuff there, because that's in our field, you know. But when we got back to States, it was hard for a black man to get that kind of job.
Willie Hilton didn't get the work that he knew how to do, but he did use the calling that came to him in the foxhole in Germany and the skill he had gained as an engineer to become a minister and build a church and come to terms with his anger.
It was really hurting. But, you know, I thank God that he moved all that stuff. He moved away from me, because you can't live with that. You can't live with hate. You can't live with what happened yesterday, a day before, last year. You got to live one day at a time and make the best of it and, you know, get along with people.
It taught me that people are the same all over, number one. I remember when we jumped in Holland, I expected a big brute for a German, you know, ruthless and this and the other. And that's the way they pictured the Germans to us. And I remember the first German I saw wounded, maybe 17, 18 years old. And he was saying, "Mein Mutter, mein Mutter." mein Mutter. And, you know, you stop, he's just like you are. And on top of that, the kid had a rosary in his pocket. A Catholic German? My gosh, they're supposed to be heathens, and, you know, animals. And here they're just like us. I learned that we have a lot to be thankful for in this country, and I was glad to get back. I've never been back since, reunions or otherwise. So, but I like it here. And I think all the GIs say the same thing. They're glad to be back home.
World War II was a time of sort of universal commitment. And it seems like everyone was involved in some way or other. And it was a time of closeness, not only in military organizations, but, you know, in the community too. And that I've never experienced since, either in the Korean War or Vietnam War, or either one. It was a different time. The commonality of purpose, I think, was what was unique about that.
The advance of the British, Canadians, and Americans.
I'm here to tell you, war is hell. You see so many men with no head, you know, laying everywhere, children, women's, tanks running over them.
If we hadn't have gotten in there when we did and started sending over 50 destroyers to England and starting the supply line and eventually getting the troops over there, I really believe that all of Europe would have been a concentration camp. Germany would have taken it over. There's no question in my mind.
Victory is in our grasp. We have the opportunity to stamp out evil like this. It's up to us to supply that final punch that will mean peace in this war-weary world.
When the common purpose is the same for everyone, there is never a thought about anything but success.
Supreme Commander Eisenhower joins General Simpson, commander of the 9th Army, on a tour of inspection of what was once part of the Siegfried Line at Jülich. This is one of the first places where we cracked the shell of Nazi resistance and brought the Hun to his knees.
So we did succeed in stopping Hitler's ambitions. Then we ended up with a Cold War with the Russians, our allies.
It was a single engine, single place aircraft, in other words, pilot only. You fired the guns, you dropped the bombs, you fired the rockets. It was a good airplane to fly because it would bring you back. It was tough. They called it the Jug. The 109 is faster than the P-47. And, but I was able at long range to get a few strikes on him. After a point, you get committed and you just don't break off. You just press on, I find. And he completed his loop, his split S, and I completed mine. But as I completed mine, I clipped the top out of a pine tree. And suddenly in the cockpit there was pine needles. It smelled real good. I thought it was the end. But the old Jug clipped the tree and came on up fighting, and I finally got him. The support of the high-flying bomber force was a different kind of mission. The fighter mission there was protect. And that becomes an entirely different scene. A world where high-altitude flak shoots down planes quickly, where the German fighters, all that they have left, are up there trying to prevent the bombers from getting to their targets. And the air battle that ensues is something to behold, and it's something that you never forget. The magnitude of loss that occurs when a large airplane a wing is shot off or it catches on fire, and you just know what those people on board are going through.
Facing the brief but furious German counteroffensive in Belgium.
I think the Bulge developed as somewhat of a surprise to the American forces. They did not anticipate it to occur.
That particular area in the Ardennes, from Luxembourg on in there through the Ardennes area, it was wintertime, it was snow on the ground, the weather was bad. When the German hit with all of that might, all of those panzer divisions, tank divisions, infantry, when they hit, of course, they punched a hole 50 to 60 miles deep.
Our job is to protect the soldiers. The fact we was in front of the soldiers was not an easy task because we had all kind of mines that had to be dealt with.
It was a lot of digging in and fighting. The Germans employed their tanks so well that it was very difficult to root them out.
That many cases that I've had to drop back behind and blow up bridges that we crossed to keep the enemies from falling.
It wasn't a picnic. It was hard. A lot of us didn't make it, and a lot of people are still buried there.
We were attached to ground troops as tankers, tank destroyers, to destroy tanks when they call upon us.
It's very hot. The fumes from the guns are very bad, and sometimes you can't see at all in there. It's very tight, very close quarters, and sometimes you stay in there for long periods of time. In the Battle of the Bulge, it was 2 weeks in the Ardennes in wintertime, where we did not. I did not wash my hands for 2 weeks straight.
We fought our way up to the Rapido River, which incidentally, the water turned pink there from blood shed by the Allies.
Hell on Wheels was the motto of the 2nd Armored Division. Well, Hitler called the division Roosevelt's Butchers. We had radios in those tanks. They were the old tube type, but they worked. And so the platoon leader would give us instructions. He'd get his from the company commander and battalion commander. We would all stay together.
I was one of the first into Rome. The people cheered us, threw flowers, and I was hit by a loaf of bread. And I held on to that bread, and I'm telling you, I'll never forget how good it was.
And now the Nazis begin to feel the renewed might of Bastogn's defenders. Enemy equipment is shattered and many prisoners are taken.
I said, I see green traces over there. I see yellow traces over here. I see red traces over here. I said, if I didn't know any better, I'd say we were surrounded. If you picture a bulge like this, Bastogne was here, and they could not take Bastogne. We denied them that. Because we denied them that, we denied them the crossroads.
Patton's armor races madly to the relief of Bastogne, where parts of the 9th and 10th Armored Divisions and the 101st Airborne, tough paratroopers and glider men were surrounded by the enemy.
And we were physically surrounded. And then Patton came through and busted through and saved us, really. But I remember Patton made a remark, what, an American division surrounded?
This is Bastogne, the town that General McAuliffe refused to surrender. Smashed American equipment testifies to the courage of its defenders.
After that, there was really very little significant organized, planned, strategic resistance on the part of the Germans. It was merely a fall back and survive policy that they knew the war was over, I think.
The advance of the British, Canadians, and Americans with the use of anti-tank devices flattens the bulge as a prelude to the Russian drive.
It delayed the war. Instead of pushing forward where we were in December into the January and February, we were delayed a good month and a half before we could get the bulge out of the way and then get reinforced and then crank up the offensive and march on toward the Rhine and then...
You become, I mean, not detached, but it's just something you have to do, and you don't do it emotionally anymore. In fact, I remember having blood on my hands, eating with, I mean, where was I going to wash my hands? Where was anybody going to wash their hands? I might have blood on my hands from maybe half a dozen people, maybe a dozen. And you eat that way, you sleep that way, you fight that way.
German victory signs were abandoned with Nazi hopes as they retreated. Their dead symbolized the last stand of the Reich. These captured Germans won't be seeing us in Berlin.
And that was their last opportunity. And when we finally broke through and cleaned out the bulge, from then on the war changed entirely.
armies have driven into the Saar as the Russians battle just a few miles east of Berlin. The crossing of the Rhine has spelled the doom of Nazi hopes of victory.
We crossed the Rhine, I believe it was the 16th of April. And from then on, we just, we had targets of opportunities to go out on a mission with just a flight and just look for targets.
We constructed bridges, all type of bridges, to transport the soldiers across the Rhine River, the Oil River.
We would be into what they call a holding area. The engineers would be up there, sometimes under fire, putting those pontoons across, and then when the pontoon bridge was ready, they would call us up by unit, and we would go sometimes bumper to bumper across those bridges. And that's the way we crossed. We crossed the Ruhr that way, we crossed the Rhine that way. And very dangerous at times because sometimes the Germans would be strafing.
I thought at one point after we built the first bridge across the Rhine River, I thought that the men would be a little shaky because the whole river was covered with bodies because the bridge, they were large against the bridge, and the whole river was just covered with dead men.
General Patton was the I Corps commander when I was in Africa.
Jumped out of his tank wearing his shiny helmet, his pearl-handled pistol, his riding boots and breeches with his riding crop just whapping against his leg. Where is the blankety man he could curse? Commanding officer of this scruffy, no-good outfit. Why don't you have a haircut, and why aren't you shaved? He said, well, sir, shaved, we're here at the edge of the desert, we're short on water. Fetch your Jeep. He had the driver bring the Jeep, raise the hood, open the radiator, stick your finger in there. Do you feel anything wet? In those days, you didn't have foamy. You used a brush and soap. And he says, now, I want every man shaved within the next hour.
And we had to wear a tie, and we could take the tie off from 2 to 4 o'clock, 2 in the afternoon to 4. We were allowed to take the tie off in Africa.
Started instilling discipline.
And it paid off.
We started coming together.
I think that's what I'll always remember Patton for those, thank him for instilling that into all the personnel.
We commenced to win battle after battle after battle. And I thank God for General Patton, because that man, in his way, saved a lot of Americans.
Entering the final phase of victory over Hitler's Nazis, Yank armies swarm across Western Germany, bringing devastation to cities of the Reich.
It was a chaos. There was buildings, there was cities big as Newport News, Hampton, Norfolk. Wasn't nothing in it but a chimney.
It was bad in some areas because we would come through not the big concentration camps, but some of the smaller ones, and we saw all of that. And we were pretty tensed up about Germans. Let's face it, we had a very bad feeling.
The Supreme Commander sees demonstrations of the torture racks. How many were put to the torch, no one will know.
And how those people they burned them up. I had them all fenced in, and they were still burning when we got there. And it's one of the awful things that you ever smell is flesh, burning flesh. It's an odor that you never, ever forget.
But then when the war was over and we saw all those people huddled in shelters in the basements of homes and factories and everything, prisoners of the Russians, just prisoners of everything, it was a sad situation, because here are thousands, probably millions of people all over Germany that were just coming out of basements.
The white flag of surrender flies all along the battle-torn route.
I'll tell you, that ship coming into New York with all the fireboats out there and the Statue of Liberty was something that you just can't describe it. You just can't describe it.
And it really took effect on our families back here. They know who's in the war, but then when the pictures and stuff come out that the people are fighting in the war and never see a black face, it was so unjust. And it's a hurting thing. And it's still hurt. The wound is still there. And that's 50 years ago.
It seems like everyone was involved in some way or other. And it was a time of closeness, not only in military organizations, but, in the community too. And that I've never experienced since.
So I went back into the service and was sent back overseas 2 or 3 times. I can remember when Vice President Barclay came over there to visit, and I took him to my foxhole, believe it or not, on Anzio beachhead. They couldn't get over there. My foxhole was still there.
I was really bitter after I found out that at home things had not changed at all. It's the same thing.
I learned that we have a lot to be thankful for in this country, and I was glad to get back. I think all the GIs say the same thing. They're glad to be back home.